we go. Athletic identity. I think for a lot of people, it's not always certain what it is, but the actual definition is the degree to which an individual identifies with their athletic role and what that looks like for others. So typically this starts at a young age when you start little league, when you start, like those beginning sports in those like sampling years, and you kind of just like start to assign your self-worth with your identity and your identity with your self-worth. So it gets a little bit tangled up as kids, but then like as adults who also run and who enjoy spending time on the roads and the trails, this is like something that can sometimes happen when if we don't hit our PR, or if we don't PR every race, or if we don't hit a certain standard that like we think we should hit, things get a little bit blurry. So understanding athletic identity is sort of thinking about athletic identity as a house, and everyone's house is going to be different. So if you had like a single room cabin and that single room was running, like we're going to try to like expand off of that single room and add like writing or painting or dogs or other things. So the house should have multiple rooms. Maybe it has an attic, backyard, front porch, whatever it is, but each of these spaces can be thought of as like a different identity in like the whole person. With that being said, however, we don't spend all of our time in one room. Like we spend different amounts of time in different rooms, some more than others, depending on you. So that's one way to think about it that is interesting and helpful for me. So this first exercise that I want you to do is if you have a piece of paper and something to write with, let's get that out. And then we're going to make a little pie chart and sort of help you guys figure out what your own athletic identity is. One way that's helpful to do this is if you have done a values worksheet and you sort of know what your values already are, those can also be implemented in this. So on your piece of paper, you're going to write down, 10, 15, 20 things that you identify as, which there are a couple of examples here: partner, dog parent, writer, engineer, nurse, gardener, mushroom forager, whatever it is. So you can start with that. I'll give you a couple minutes to sort of write those things down, and then we'll move on to the next step. So just give me like a thumbs up when y'all are ready. I'm going to do this too. Okay, how you guys feeling? Good? Okay. All right. So next step, we're going to draw a circle on our piece of paper like this. You can't see me, can you? Draw a circle. And then using that list that you've written out on the left, we're going to make a pie chart. So you can break the circle into as many pieces as you want based off of how much you identify. So maybe for like a third of my pie chart, I might put like coach. And then another sliver will go into like I don't know, writer, coffee lover, things like that. And so everyone's pie chart will look different, but just break it into a couple of different chunks so that you can see sort of like what you identify as most. Okay, how's everyone feeling? Good, good. Okay, so we're gonna take these pie charts and we're gonna hold on to these for later. They might change based off of like what we're about to talk about. But this is a really great place to start when sort of figuring out what your athletic identity is, what your identity is as like a human before the athlete, and how you can find like a really good human athlete balance for the situations where we might get injured or sick or really busy with work and like experience like a setback. Natasha, did you have a question?
Yeah, I'm just wondering if anybody else felt like they were just totally guessing on the percentages here because I just felt like I don't know. I didn't know how big to put each section. I don't know if
Yeah,
that's part of the activity.
that's totally okay. Totally normal. Those slices will change depending on various like situations in life too. So it's totally okay. I think that's kind of like the fun part of this exercise is figuring out like how much each slice takes up and if there's any wiggle room to adjust later. Cool. Okay, so from here, we're going to hold on to this piece of paper for just a second, and I'm going to run you through a really quick, condensed version of an athletic identity measurement assessment called the AIMS. And so what this is, it's 4 questions, and it's on a scale from like 1 being, you know, never to 5 being always. So we're just going to go through this really quick and you'll have a general idea to apply to your pie chart. Okay, that's the wrong one. Okay, so athletic identity measurement scale. Question number 1 is a sport-centric self-view. So on a scale from 1 to 10, 1 to 5, the question is, I consider myself primarily as an athlete. And again, 1 is never, 5 is always. So least to most. Okay. Question number 2 is I feel anxious or lose self-esteem when I am not participating in sports.
5 being always.
Yes, 5 being always. Okay, question 3. My friends see me primarily as an athlete. 1, not at all. 5, very much. And question 4, I prioritize training and competing over other important activities. 1 is never, 5 is always. Okay, so for scoring here, you can tally up your scores for those 4 questions. If you were a 5 on every question, you'd be a 20, you know. You guys can do math probably better than I can. So if your score leans towards the high end, this might be an indication to explore or develop other areas of interest outside of like just running or just sports. And we can like work together to figure out how to build a more balanced self. Okay, so the formation of athletic identity, like I talked about a little bit earlier, usually starts when we are younger, because we're spending all of our free time doing these things as kids. We're in all of the sports. I think it's called the sampling years. Christina and I were kind of talking about this the other day, where the ages between 6 and 12 are kind of for like trying out everything, right? And then typically after that, you start to focus on one sport or one identity. But your athletic identity is so powerful. So if we know ourselves as athletes and others know us as like Kristen the coach or Kristen the runner, whatever, like that's an okay thing as long as it's not the only thing. So the tough thing about athletic identity is that it's sort of a double-edged sword. I think sometimes the way we talk about it, it seems like it's a really bad thing to only identify as like a runner or an athlete, but it's not necessarily like the worst thing. There's a quote here from Brad Stulberg who says, athletes like marathon runners might see themselves primarily as runners, which is fine until it's all they see themselves as. So there's another little exercise here where you can think of 3 times when you identified solely as an athlete and when that has benefited you. Examples of that could be, you know, like showing up on the start line as an athlete and having a good race. It could be getting through a really tough workout or navigating an injury, where like having that athletic identity is sort of what pulled you through the like hours of physical therapy. And then on the other side of that, let's think of 3 to 5 times when it has not benefited you. And this could include an imbalance in personal relationships, maybe being late for a work meeting because you're out on a run. You know, there's lots of different examples where it can where it cannot be beneficial, or if you identify too much as an athlete and then you get injured and everything kind of crumbles around you. Like that's definitely something that I've experienced. Not calling you out, Ren. I'm so sorry. All right. So once we have those, we're going to just move on and talk a little bit about why it matters. And why athletic identity matters is because identity work is an ongoing process. You're constantly changing, you're constantly evolving, you're constantly finding new things that you're interested in or that you realize you're not interested in, which leads us to the fact that change is the only constant in life, right? I think there's a lot of conversations happening about this, is that like when you know what your values are, you can sort of get through any challenge. There's a quote that says like, if you know your why, you can get through any how. And that also applies to athletic identity. So everyone experiences a setback eventually, right? Ren's sick, Jacob's sick, Matt's coming off an injury. Like we've all had these experiences that have kind of stopped us in our tracks in terms of identity and where we want to be and where we currently are, like realistically in the moment. And that's not always fun. So having a loose grip on our identity solely as an athlete is important because we can reframe and like look at other things. So if I get injured, I was injured for 2 years, and during that 2-year injury, I started writing a book. So there's different ways that we can reframe and other things that we can do to continue to like evolve to our best selves, if that makes sense. Okay, so I'm going to shut this down and open it back up to discussion, and see if anyone has any questions. I would love to hear stories about your guys' experience with athletic identity, when it's been helpful, when it's not been helpful, and how you kind of navigate these different setbacks. Does anyone want to start? All right, Natasha, you're up.
So this is a topic I actually talk about a lot. I was excited about today because I actually teach a course that overlaps with this, focused on mental health. And so I see it a lot, like definitely personally, but I see it a lot just in the community because I live in Lake Tahoe. So like everybody's an athlete and everybody's identity is centered on moving outdoors. And so anytime an injury or illness comes along, I see a disconnect from your community and from your friends because you hang out with your friends on the trail. And a lot of mental health challenges that come from it, that often don't get shared because, similar to what you're saying, I feel like a lot of people lean on their sport as their coping tool. And so then these things get kind of pop up. And yeah, I've had a lot of conversations when people are injured or coming off of an injury and they open up about like how dark the last couple of months or year has been. And so I just appreciate us talking about it for sure to start that conversation. And personally, it's something that even though I'm so aware of it, that I try to help other people through it, I still struggle every time it happens. Like I've been sick for the last 4 weeks, and do my best to get through that without, going on walks with my dog and being satisfied with that for a very long time. And even sometimes that's too hard. So.
Yeah, totally. I think one thing that's really interesting about the mental health component here is that like when we experience an injury, or whether it's like career-ending injury, season-ending injury, whatever it is, we go through the 5 stages of grief, So like there's this whole emotional process that we go through where we're like letting go, trying to accept, feeling angry, feeling sad. A lot of times, when I've been injured, I've just thought like, what is the point of all of this? I know like some athletes have texted me that too. What's the point of this? This might be it for me. And so sort of understanding what athletic identity is helpful for moments like that where you want to give up. But there's so many reasons not to. And this is just like a conversation about that because it is so important. And when you have a community like yours, Natasha, and Lake Tahoe, where everyone's an athlete, that's when like me personally, if I find myself in those situations, I'm like, can we start a book club? Like who's listening to Taylor Swift? Like having all these like not weird conversations, but different conversations outside of running. Because I think one of the most beautiful things about trail running and the people that we find in the running community is that everyone has so many interests outside of just running, right? Like I think one of my favorite conversations with an athlete was actually with Ren when she described her sort of perspective and philosophy around running as like, wanting to feel like a golden retriever romping through the woods. And that just like, it makes me so happy. And I think about it all the time. Like when I'm having a bad run, I'm like, nope, like switching into like golden retriever mode, because like it's something that we get to do. It's not something that we're forced to do. Like we're actively choosing to like do this crazy thing. So I think that that's really important as well. So does anyone have anything else? Like, does anyone want to share anything about like a struggle that they've gone through that has sort of like challenged their athletic identity?
I guess I'm just thinking more so like the pie chart, because when I was going through that, I put a big piece of the pie for my job, and then I put like a big piece of pie for like being a mom. And I was like, oh no, like they're like my athlete deserves a big piece of this pie, and my like I ran out of slices, like I ran out of room. And then but that was eye-opening to me, right? Because it's kind of like there's the struggle. Like I'm trying to make everything have a large piece of the pie when it's just not possible to do that. So it's kind of like eye-opening for me in a way to kind of think about, okay, like how can I reframe things a little bit and not be so consumed by that. And that comes up a lot, like in being a mom to small kids, right? It's like they are everything, and sometimes I make them too much of everything, which is kind of hard to wrestle with. But it's actually like I just found that so eye-opening when I actually had to start dividing the pie, because I wanted to give the pie to all of these pieces, and you just can't. So anyways, that's going to be really interesting for me to kind of continue to reflect on and figure out like where do they belong, and how can I find the that ever elusive balance, right?
Yes, exactly. And the amazing thing about this pie chart is that, like I have mine here too, and I don't know if you can see it, but it changes every week, like depending on like that week's priorities or that week's goals or whatever it is. Like those slices aren't always the same width, I guess. They're not always the same size. And sort of the way that I was talking about earlier, where like thinking of athletic identity like a house, like I don't spend all of my time in the bathroom. Some days I do. I don't spend all of my time in the kitchen. Some days I do, so it just sort of like depends on what's going on in my life, or like how much time I want to dedicate to certain things is like totally dependent on the season of life. So if you're training for like a big race, like a little bit more time is going to have to be spent with just running, and then that will like cut down on some of the other pieces of the pie, which is really interesting because when you can see it tangibly, like I like having these, I have a couple of these in different rooms throughout the house where I can sort of see it and it'll remind myself. So sometimes I can use it as motivation, but other times I can use it as like a check-in where it's like, do I need to spend this much pie time on this one thing, or can I focus a little bit more energy here or here or here? So that's really cool that like resonated with you too, Jess, because I think that that's something that the first time I did this exercise, seeing it on paper was a little bit of a reality check. So. Does anyone have anything else they want to add?
I
I need to drop for a
wrote
work call. But I was just gonna say real quick, yeah, um, you know, I've gone through some injuries this spring, and it's kind of, you know, it's been tough. But one of the things that was the hardest was that I was spending a lot of time marathon training, and I was running with groups. So that was like the hardest thing is like I put, father and husband as the biggest pieces of my pie because that's the most important things to me. But um, I was spending so much time with other people, and then being injured, I wasn't able to do that as much. So um, I don't know. I basically had to find a way to um, be able to reach out and still communicate with people, even though I couldn't show up on these group runs, and like kind of feel like I was still part of a community, even though I wasn't able to do that. So, yeah.
Yeah, I think that's so important because I think that having the community aspect and like being a member in your community, that never goes away, whether you're injured or not. It feels like it sometimes. Like if you can't show up at the 5 a.m. group runs, you're like, oh, but like, who am I then? Like, where do I fit in this pie chart? But that I think is the time to lean into this community, lean into your coach, lean into like your wife and your kids, and sort of like use those as opportunities to sort of flourish in other areas as well. But you can also always volunteer, show up with donuts at the end of the run, like you can still show up in various ways. It's just like when these setbacks happen, I think they're really cool opportunities to sort of like challenge us to get creative in how we show up and like still finding that best version of who we want to be based off of our values. And I think that you can apply that across the board. It's like when I get injured, who do I want to show up as? When my kid doesn't sleep, which means that I don't sleep, who am I going to show up as? So kind of using the pie chart as like a way to just check in sometimes. But yeah, I love
Thank you.
that perspective, Matt. I know you have to drop, so I'm glad
All right.
you were
Have
able
a great
to
one. See
join
ya.
us. Yeah. Jacob, I think you were about to say something too.
Yeah, I don't know about other people. I struggle with the idea of being an athlete. Like I didn't grow up doing athletics. Running is a very new endeavor for me. And I don't have a running community. All my friends that are athletic all live, an hour away from me. And all my friends like in my immediate community they're not runners, they're not athletic in any way. Um, so for me, I just kind of struggle with that identity of like, I guess I am an athlete, but I don't feel like it. And then trying to find a community of people to like do like all of my runs are by myself. Like it's very rare that I get to do group runs.
Yeah.
So it's kind of that dichotomy of like,
Yeah, it's almost the opposite problem.
yeah,
Yeah.
unfortunately or fortunately, I guess.
Yeah, I definitely understand that. And I think as adults, it's really challenging to find people to do all of our training runs with us just because we all have different schedules and lives and priorities, but I think one way to get in some semblance of community is to like show up for local group runs or plan to meet friends on the weekends, which like I know you've done before, but I think just the reality is that like it's really hard to coordinate timelines with other people. So one thing that I like to do is if I'm able to break a run in half, I'll do like the first part of my run with my dog in the morning and then like show up at the local group run and like can split that into a double. So that's always an option. I think that volunteering for trail work and going to like the Trail Run Film Fest and like finding events like that within your community will help you find that group of people who can maybe like show up consistently throughout the week and run with you. But it is tough, like to find that community. Natasha, what is the like trail running community like in Lake Tahoe?
I have been slowly but surely finding it. So interestingly enough, Jacob, like as much as I'm in a very athletic place, it's like primarily skiing in the winter, mountain biking in the summer. It's all very like adrenaline focused. I also lived in a more like remote area and moved to the big city of South Lake, which is not a big city at all, about 3 years ago. So I've been like trying to develop the community, and I have like just, picked up a friend here, picked up a friend there. I usually run with my dog. And then I finally learned about maybe a running group that I haven't actually gone to. So it's really been slow and word of mouth. And I think the one race I am signed up for this year has been like I signed up, and then my friend signed up, and then another friend signed up, and then their friend signed up, And so now I'm learning about more runners in the area just because we all signed up for a race that's 3 hours away. So I think it exists, but it seems like it takes a really long time to discover it. There's more, and like you've seen in the chat, the Slack chat, I know there's a lot of running groups in like Carson City and Reno, maybe Sacramento, I'm not sure. But I don't think there's as much gatherings in South Lake specifically yet, although I've thought about starting some.
Yeah, I think that's a really good like point that you just ended on too, though, is like the idea of starting like if what you are looking for doesn't exist yet, like you can create it, you know. And I think that's something that's really cool, because I know, Jacob, that there are runners in Colorado Springs. They're out there. So I think like starting a group or finding a group that like coordinates with your schedule is a really great place to start. But then again, too, like I know you're friends with some other athletes on the team that are running every weekend and doing these things, and when you guys run together, it's so much fun. And I just like I hear from all of you that it's like, oh yeah, we got to go do this, and we did, you know, did this like crazy run. And that's always really, really cool. And sometimes for me, those are the runs that will pull me through the week. You know, if I'm like, oh, I gotta run for 4 days by myself, but on Saturday and Sunday I get to run with my friends, like sometimes that's enough. Other times I'll go to the local like Fleet Feet run on a Thursday night. And that kind of like helps, but it is really tough to like coordinate schedules. So, but yeah, I think one way to like sort of start building that community as well is like showing up at races, volunteering, like making new friends while you're running. That's always really fun. Some of my closest friends I've met through running groups and during trail races where we've just been like stuck together for 6 miles at a time. Like, hey, who are you? Like, what are you into? Like, do you like dogs? I like dogs. And just like having those conversations and then hanging out at the finish line and just kind of like being curious and getting to know people.
That's really good feedback. I'll just have to be less socially awkward.
Let me know when you find out the secret to that.
Yeah, if there's
I will.
a secret
I
sauce,
will.
I think the secret is that everyone is socially awkward and just nobody talks about it. I learned that recently. I just completed this 8-month leadership program yesterday, and I was having like all this anxiety about different things. And I talked to one other person who was also feeling it. And then months later, I found out this person, we're all feeling it and just nobody's talking about it. So I think that's the secret.
Yeah, we all think we're the one goldfish in the fishbowl.
Oh, everyone doesn't know what to do with their hands.
as I'm like gripping my coffee cup.
I'm like playing with a pen, like.
Yeah, exactly. I think I don't know, I just like I love this topic because I think it applies to so many different parts of life and different parts of running, you know, that I think there's a lot of ways to like build community and sort of figure out your identity within that community. But I think it's important too, you know, there's the saying like you become most like the 5 closest people you spend time with. And if you spend time with people who are like if you run with people who are faster than you will inevitably get faster. If you spend time with people who write a lot, you might also start writing a lot. So I think that's something that's really interesting too. And like, if there's a piece of your identity that you want to develop, finding people within your community who know more than you do, or who spend more time doing something like that, like spending time with them will inevitably help you get better. So Natasha, what do you got?
I just had an idea, and I don't know if I've used this in the past, but another way for when like we're injured or sick to still feed that identity is like listening to podcasts on running or reading books on running. I had a concussion many years ago, and there was definitely unique ways to still feel connected to many parts of myself. So it's just another idea, because you had mentioned all the podcasts are talking on certain things. I actually don't listen to a running podcast, but I'm sure there's countless, and there's amazing books from runners as well. So just another idea. Might be kind of cool to hear recommendations from one another.
Yes, I love that idea. I think that's great. Like we could have like a free little library in our community Slack, like all of the book recommendations. I think that's a really interesting point too. There was a point where during COVID, I left the town. I was living in Boulder and I left, and I felt so isolated and like removed from the community. And I think we all did during COVID. But one thing that really helped me was listening to podcasts and reading books by people that I admired in the running community. And still, like, you still get that like feeling of connection. And say what you will about social media, I think that that is one aspect of social media that is actually beneficial for building community. So that's something worth leaning into as well. And typically when an athlete gets injured, I like to tell them, like, as their coach, like, this is the time I'm like I'm in your corner, lean in hard. Don't just like back out and say, I'm injured, I'm worthless, I can't do this, I don't belong. Like, during any sort of setback is when you should like lean in the most. So I think that that's something that I try to practice on my own with my own coach as well, where I'm like, like, had really high anxiety today, didn't want to run, but like, maybe need to like explain why, or lean into that community, or focus on something else for a while, but just kind of like using those as opportunities to get curious about why, and like what part of your identity that sort of slides into.
I don't know if this is off topic, but it seems tangential. But when you mentioned social media, is talking about comparing yourself with other athletes aligned with this athletic identity? Because I find that, I think personally, I probably have to stay away from social media because of that comparison, and like Strava, and you see everyone like, oh, they're running their 5-10 miles, but then also just, looking at people's pace. That's one for me as well. That might be a whole other topic, but it just came to mind, and I see a lot of heads nodding, so I figured I would bring it up.
Yeah, I think everyone can relate to that. Yeah, I think if when you're injured or sick and can't run, if you're finding yourself on Strava a lot, looking at other people's runs or paces, or Instagram, and comparing yourself to them, I think that is a really great time to shut it down. Like, take a break, remove the app from your home screen. You can mute people, you can unfollow people if you need to. But I definitely yes, want to have a bigger conversation around that, because I think we all really struggle with that. Or when you see someone who runs like a 20-mile run at 7-minute mile pace, and they label it as like easy, like that makes me hot just thinking about, like, it makes me so frustrated.
Like, shut up, James. We know you're lying.
Yeah, exactly. Like, were you on a bike? How is this not flagged? So yeah, I think that's definitely something worth exploring too.
And I think it's like the highlight reel, right? Because and then when you talk about a bad run, you feel guilty for talking about a bad run. It's like no one else is talking about how their run sucked. And then you're kind of like, well, A, like, I'm being negative, and B, no one else has a bad run. So it's like that highlight reel of like, every run is great and they're hitting their paces, they're nailing their workouts, they're speedy, they're getting towards their goals. And meanwhile, like, no one talks about, oh, like, they have a little niggle, or like, they're just, there's so many, like, we all have our stuff, right? Like, everyone has things, we all work through things, we all have lives outside of it, but it's like an echo chamber. And I had my half marathon last weekend, and it didn't go well in terms of what I wanted for my goal time for lots of different reasons. And I had a close friend of mine say, like, you need to get off Instagram and get off the echo chamber, because all I was seeing was how everyone had nailed and got their goal time, right? And she's like, just running that half marathon in of itself is a feat, but you'll never appreciate that because of this echo chamber we're in. Should like zoom out, think about like all the other people around you and just be proud that you showed up and you did it. And like this friend of mine is like almost like this wise mentor. Like she has like 5 kids and I feel like she just collected all these life lessons as a result of that. But like she always just drops these truth bombs on me like that. And that is a really good perspective, right? Because I agree with you, Kristen. Like it's such a good place for connection, especially if you live in like, you know, areas where you don't have a great running community, but it's a double-edged sword. And I think you almost have to find your own sweet spot. Like how much time can I spend on there to get that sense of connection? And then when is too much, that leads me down this path of kind of, it's not good for me. Right. But I'm glad others feel that way because it makes me feel like less alone in those thoughts.
Yeah.
I tend to unfollow the people who are promoting the echo chamber as opposed to actually talking about what went wrong. Because when I am having a terrible run, as one does, I want to talk about it with somebody who is going to validate that, yeah, it was a terrible run and that tomorrow is going to be better. And if I'm surrounded by people who are saying this, that, and the other thing about how everything was great and nothing's ever gone wrong for them, I don't trust that person to be a good sounding board. So I filter for people who will sit and validate the suck.
Yep. Absolutely. I think like bad runs happen to good people all the time, you know? And I think that the mute feature on, I think there's one on Strava now too. The mute feature on Strava and Instagram and all social media is like such an excellent tool, because if we're only seeing the successful highlight reels, the successful stories, I think that changes the stories that we tell ourselves about ourselves. And Jess, in your case, in the half marathon, I think just like showing up to the start line is like one of the bravest things that we can do, because training blocks are so difficult and there are so many challenges that we face in like navigating training blocks, that making the decision to show up on the day of the race, like that's a huge decision. That takes a lot of courage. So, you know, I definitely want to like validate what you said, because I feel that too, you know, and I think having conversations around that are really important. But I also agree with you, Ren, in that like filtering my echo chamber with like varying degrees of highlight reels and low light reels, I think is really important. Just trying to keep it as realistic as possible.
I had someone tell me years ago that when I compare and compete, I'll lose every single time just because it robs me of my happiness, right? Like my friends did 100 at Wassa last weekend, and like that wasn't my goal going into it, but I compared, you know, what I did compared to them, and it just robbed me of like the experience of what I did do.
Mm-hmm.
So every time, no matter what, because like I don't know what their background is, I don't know, you know, they fudging the nut, like I just don't know what their circumstances is.
Yeah, totally. And I think that's one thing that's really important going into races, like yours last weekend, where we went in with the goal of like seeing what works nutrition wise and like having the most fun. And not everyone's goal is going to be the same, you know, like that wasn't an A race for you. It was like a really great opportunity to practice nutrition and like trying new foods and you know, having fun. But I definitely think that your point about like comparison being the thief of joy is accurate. So accurate. I think a lot of us run into that.
I had a friend, one of the only people that I run with regularly. They run a marathon like every 2 weeks or once a month, or they're trying to do one in every state. And they were signed up for a 50 miler, which I think was their first one ever. And they had to stop around, I think, mile 27 or 28 because of so much pain. And when I talked to them, they were like really defeated about it because they're like, oh, it's my first did not finish. Well, I'm like, you finished 27 miles. You know, like, I know that maybe your bib said you were aiming to finish 50, but you finished quite a lot. And it's just such an interesting perspective because to me, I was blown away, but to them, because that was, what their name was registered under, it caused all this like defeat and sadness around not getting to what was, I guess, marked as the finish line. And I just thought, number one, it was really interesting from an outsider's perspective. Number two, I would have totally felt the same way. And like, thank goodness for friends and community like this to be a reflective board, a sounding board for when we don't have that kind of perspective. So I'm really glad that we're, having these conversations and look forward to more of them when all of these things are going to pop up as we go along.
Mhm. Yeah, and I think that's one thing that I appreciate so much about the Slack channel is that like no one's ever going to have a perfect training block, right? Like that's a nice idea, but it doesn't exist. It's like not everything is going to go perfectly like and according to plan. So like having the community in Slack or through a newsletter or like just sometimes just knowing that there are people who are rooting for you and are in your corner is helpful to like navigate situations like that. Because they're not going to stop happening, I just want to like help build, like come at this with like a pretty broad toolbox where like we can meet each other where we are and help navigate through those setbacks and those sort of like spiraling thoughts of comparison and where we should be and things like that. But yeah, I want to be like an echo chamber of like positivity, but with like a realistic bent. So yeah. I hope this was helpful. I hope it's this like breakdown of like what athletic identity is and how it can like show up in life is helpful for you guys. It's a topic that's interesting to me, and I think doing the exercise of the pie chart is really really interesting. And now like if you wanted to do another exercise with the pie chart after this, just based off of kind of like what we've talked about and just see if it has changed, and then maybe do it every month, do it every other week in your next training block, and just you can see how much those slices change in size depending on where you're at, and like what life stress you have. So I like using it as like a check-in. I have a few of them around the house in like random places. Just like, oh yeah, I should do that again. So they're helpful for me. I hope that was helpful for you too. Cool. All right. Well, I'm gonna let you guys go. I think we have like another minute. Again, my clocks are all wrong, so I think we have like 10 more minutes actually. I'm not sure, depending on the time. But I did want to like shout out an announcement that I will be sending out a newsletter this week, which I'm really excited about. It'll include the community call links. It'll include book recommendations, a quote of the week that I like am kind of stuck on, and events. So one of the events that I'm most excited to share with you guys is actually Natasha's event. She's teaching a mental health first aid class. And I am also certified in mental health first aid, but I don't teach it. But when I was in the course, I just kept thinking like, wow, everyone should be certified in mental health first aid. This is applicable to everything, everywhere, all the time. So Natasha is actually teaching an online, like a virtual course. So Natasha, if you want to chat a little bit about that, we can do that now, but I will be including the link to that course in the newsletter this week.
Yeah, thanks, Kristen. The upcoming virtual course, it's open to anyone in the US that's 18 or older, so anyone on the team can join. It's going to be at the end of the month, May 29th and 30th, 2 morning sessions. And mental health first aid is a certification course, so it's like CPR or wilderness first aid, and you learn common signs and symptoms of mental health and substance use challenges, how to have an open, non-judgmental, loving conversation with somebody you're concerned about, and what are the variety of resources that you can encourage somebody to connect with, whether that's self-help resources, a lot of what we talked about today for professionals, and not just like therapists, but like variety of professionals. It's really discussion and activity based, similar to, you know, how Kristen ran this today. And I've been using the content for 8 years now, and I've been teaching it for 3 years. So I've seen it in action. I use it almost every day. So it's something I really believe in a lot. So if you're interested, yeah, Kristen's going to share that information, but feel free to like send me a message on Slack if you have any questions. Yeah, I think that's everything. Did I miss anything?
Oh, I think that's it. Yeah, I use mine almost every day too. Where like I see something and I'm like, wait, I know what to do. So it's really helpful. And it, like, even with like checking in on myself, if I have a bad run, or if I'm like I live in Tucson, and so it's like already probably 85 degrees outside. I don't know. And so before this, when I realized that my whole presentation didn't save last night at midnight, I was like, all right, we're just going to roll with it. But sometimes, you know, if it's 85 degrees at 9 a.m. and I have to go run later, it can get pretty frustrating. But I can use what I've learned in the mental health first aid class to sort of like reframe and like move through the steps to get out the door. So it's really helpful. Would highly recommend, especially if you like, if you interact with people, if you drive across town, if you see people in the grocery store, like everyone should know kind of like what this is. So that's my plug for Natasha this week, which will also be in the newsletter. So keep an eye out for that. That'll be coming probably early this afternoon. As soon as I get my heat run in, I'll be sending that out. But thank you guys so much for joining and chatting and like helping lead the discussion, because I think that having these conversations is really important. So, and if there's any topics that you guys are interested in that you want me to cover from like a sports psych perspective, or just a coaching perspective, experience perspective, drop those in the Slack. I'm really, really excited to just like have these conversations with everyone, because I think that they're important. So yeah, hope you guys have a good weekend. Hope it's not as hot where you are as it is here. And I'll see you guys in the Slack channel.
Sounds
Thanks.
good. Thanks. Have a great weekend.
Bye guys, feel better.